Hello, my name is Andrew Lamoureux, and this is a sample lesson for my proposed junior level residential course, History of the Bassoon in Liturgical Contexts. This lesson picks up in week 6 of the course, where the goal is for students to demonstrate a knowledge of the bassoon and its predecessors' involvements in liturgical contexts. This presentation covers 3 of the proposed 6 activities for week 6, including the chain notes review, the bassoon and its predecessors, label the parts of the bassoon blind test, and professor lecture. The first 2 activities are student-based, so they will only be briefly mentioned in the recording, as it is not taking place in a typical classroom setting. I will, however, clearly note when these activities would occur in the lesson and what I plan for those activities to cover. So let's get to the presentation. Hello, and welcome back to History of the Bassoon in Liturgical Contexts. Today we'll be covering the bassoon's parts and fingerings and review what we've learned about the bassoon's predecessors. Let's start with the chain notes review. I passed out a sheet of paper with one of the predecessors of the bassoon to each of you in the class. I'd like to take the next minute and have all of you write down everything that you remember about this specific predecessor. Then you'll pass it to the person next to you, and we'll continue along making a chain of notes that we'll be able to use later on. I'll collect them all, review them to make sure that all the information is correct, and then post them onto Canvas, so you all will have additional study materials that you helped come up with in class. Okay, your time starts now. At this point, I would let the chain notes activity run for about 5 to 10 minutes, depending on the size of the class, collect the notes, and direct everyone's attention back to this presentation. So, now that we've completed our chain notes activity, let's do a full review together of the predecessors of the bassoon. Up first, we have the fagotum. So, this is kind of a trick question, but the fagotum is not actually one of the predecessors of the bassoon. As we talked about earlier in week 1, it is instead a purported ancestor of the bassoon and was not actually had any relation. The fagotum was originally existed in texts where it was compared to the dulcian, but was not actually given a picture like we have here, where we can see this is not a bassoon. This is very clearly more of a standalone bag type form of instrument. These chanters on the sides here, this is one chanter, this is the second one, uh, would actually have multiple sticks in them as holes in order for notes to come through. And this is where it got the name fagotum, as it resembles a bundle of sticks. However, as even though this resemblance has been carried on to the bassoon, it is only on the inside of this instrument, so the naked eye wouldn't actually be able to see them. So the bundle of sticks analogy for fagotum, meaning for the bassoon is actually kind of an errant myth. We don't really know for sure why that name stuck. Anyways, on to the first actual predecessor of the bassoon, the dulcian. So, this relative of the bassoon was carved from a single piece of wood. As you can see, the typical bassoon, we would have a separation kind of where the pointer is here between these two joints. This is actually just one long piece of wood joined all the way down. There is a little bar here, but you can see that in the back view, it is not there. It's kind of more for decoration. This is one continuous piece of wood. And we have this kind of crook-like structure here, which is kind of a proto-bogle. And so these were used, since it was light and portable, it was used in religious processions, as we can see here in this picture. This right here is the dulcian being played by this man right here. And so this is kind of the, I guess, the one of the first mentions of the bassoon in liturgical contexts or bassoon predecessors. And so this relationship between the dulcian and church music is kind of what we'll be tracking as we go through other predecessors of the bassoon and the bassoon itself. Next, we have the sordin, which were unique in that their two-bore system somewhat resembles the interior of the fagotum. Again, you can't see it because it's the inside. Um, but these smaller sordins kind of resemble a modern-day oboe and also have a reed that sticks right onto the instrument. The larger ones, especially the bass one here, has a crook like we saw back in the dulcian, which is again very similar to the modern-day bassoon's bocal, which has a third bore for it to be inserted into the top. Next, we move on to the bajon. Uh, it is a Spanish instrument, uh, and so this was also seen in liturgical context. It was a key role in accompanying Gregorian chants. So it was one of the if not the first instruments in at least Spanish liturgy, other than the organ, to be introduced into more liturgical worship contexts. So even though this instrument was introduced to accompany plain chant, even after the church services became more polyphonic, it was still a staple in worship. Moving on, we have the racket bassoon, which is an interesting shaped instrument. This is These are the finger holes, so you can kind of imagine that this bottom part is about the size of a hand, and then this little bell is a little smaller than that. So this is a kind of a very small instrument, but you can see a lot of the influences of this instrument in particular on the modern day bassoon, specifically the bell here. And back here, it kind of curls around and you can't see it super well, but this is another crook that again has a reed on it, which would be a predecessor to the modern day bocal. Yes. Oh, another thing about the racket bassoon is that it was used in choir school chants in France, which would be kind of a religious school. Again, yet another liturgical chant context for bassoons and bassoon-like instruments to be thought of. This is something that we'll be keeping track of for the historical outline assignment, and also to just kind of remember. Next, we have the Basse Musette du Poitou. I believe I'm pronouncing that at least somewhat correctly. This is a French uh, bass version of a French descant bagpipe, which is um, which is also a very interesting instrument here. You can kind of see where the instrument, like where this is kind of like a proto-vocal structure, again with a crook, but it's covered here with a pirouette, which is what it is. This kind of encircling object is called, and this is it put together here on the actual instrument, and this is its constituent parts. So the Boston Musette du Poitou, it was invented with a double bore design, which we see in the bassoon, except in the bassoon down here where the pointer is, where it says C on the actual image, we would expect the bore to kind of make a U shape and double back on itself. And interestingly enough, this one doesn't seem to have that kind of structure. So it's a double bored structure, but they don't actually meet like they do in the modern bassoon. And it also has more of a conical bell here, which is much different compared to what we would see in a typical modern bassoon. Next, we have the tartolt, which is a kind of, they were described as a kind of ancestor or mimic, you could say, of let's go back here, the racket. You can kind of get their similar structure in that they have a kind of larger chanter kind of area. And then the noise comes out of the bottom here. Instead of the top bell, the bell is down at the bottom, more like an oboe, even though they kind of turn on themselves. And they have this really intricate and interesting looking dragon design, which if you kind of look up at the tail of the dragon, you can kind of see how it loops back around on itself and becomes the crook. So crooks were often designed in this kind of way in order to prevent moisture from getting into the main wooden body of the instrument. And we can still see this in the modern day bocal, which has kind of a shape that would stop any kind of saliva and moisture and stuff from most of it from getting up and then back down into the actual instrument. So the tartolts themselves, there's only been one consort of tartolts found, which is these images here. These five are all that has ever been found in archaeological evidence and other historical digging around. And so, with this, allegedly, the kind of conical bore of this, you can kind of see how it starts smaller and becomes kind of an ending cone at the end of this crook here. The conical bore of this plus the cylindrical bore of the actual instrument itself would have made it overload an octave, similar to many woodwind instruments we know today. And I say allegedly because, unfortunately, these specific instruments were unplayable in the state that they were found. There have been reproductions that have been made of it, but we can't be 100% certain of their historical accuracy because they are so old. These were found in the 1500s, roughly. So the bass cromorne, is a contrabass oboe found in France in the latter half of the 17th century. It outlived the other cromornes in its cohort and became part of the oboe consort. As you can kind of see how it would resemble an English horn, just very much longer and with a longer crook. In a way, it resembles a very intermediate structure between the English horn and the bassoon. So the cromorne was invented shortly before 1651, when the first kind of historical record of a newly invented instrument starts to show up in our historical records. And this last member of the consort was used in French royal courts well into the 1670s, 1680s. Next, we have a rather silly looking instrument, the bassoon d'amour, which, despite being actually more closely related to the shawm, looks physically a lot more like the modern day bassoon than we've seen in a lot of the past, the dulcian and the other instruments. You can kind of see where the vocal is starting to take on its very unique curved shape. You can see how these two joints are separated. You can see here that they are actually two different pieces that are connected into kind of probably a similar joint-like situation that we have with the modern day bassoon, where these two pieces here connect into the bottom piece. And then there's got kind of this attachable metal bell at the top. And you kind of take away the bulbous end, and it very much resembles the modern day bassoon, despite being, again, related more closely to the shawm and having more of a shawm-like sound and range, not actually really sounding as close to the bassoon as you would expect. It's a very decorative instrument that was made for Swiss church music. So the bassoon wasn't just used in French and Spanish liturgical contexts, it was used all across Europe. Next, we have some proto-bassoons. The one that is encircled is actually a quartot, not a proto-bassoon. These were all kind of lumped together in a historical record as proto-bassoons, but later on this was found to be a quartot, this one in the middle, which is kind of an ancestor of the bassoon, but more of a distant relative and kind of side relegation, not fully influential. You can see how it's more closely related to the oboe, where there's no bell up top, and the reed is here, and it kind of comes in from the top like an oboe or an English horn would. And this is kind of where histories for the oboe and English horn and the bassoon kind of start to diverge. And so you can see these proto-bassoons each have like a bell kind of structure and a vocal kind of structure here off to the side that's offset. You can see the little vocal here and the bell here. And you can see that they've started to, the artist has very specifically and purposely made this break in the wood here that you can kind of see where it starts to resemble what we saw previously in the bassoon d'amour, where these are two separate pieces. So you can kind of see now that the typical distinctive bassoon shape is really starting to take form. And they were based loosely on the Dulcian in that they were designed to be anti-Dulcians. They were meant to do things that the Dulcian could not, kind of filling in holes, niche partitioning, if you will, of musical contexts. So in that way, they kind of outperformed and became a different thing from the Dulcian, even though they both ended up converging into the same one bassoon that would take both of their roles in the future. Now we come up to the Baroque bassoon, which is the closest ancestor to the modern day bassoon, where all of these things kind of converge, and then the Baroque bassoon develops into the modern bassoon. All of the kind of ancestral traits, you can kind of see them come in here. You can see the vocal here, the crook that became the vocal. You can see the bell starting to take more of a typical bassoon-like shape, though it's more decorative as you kind of see here. It's got a bit of a ridge and a bulge up here where it's not the what you would consider typical with a bassoon, where it kind of just comes out and then there's a little circle at the top. We'll see that later when we go over the actual modern bassoons parts. So here we have, the long joint and the wing joint here. This is kind of like the bottom joint, and you can see that there's only like two, maybe a couple more keys for the thumbs in the back. This is very different to the modern bassoon, which has many keys on the back and a lot for the thumbs to do. And this kind of lack of flexibility is what led to the development and mechanization of the modern bassoon, which allowed the modern bassoon to fully take over the Baroque bassoon's contexts. Last but certainly not least, we have the modern day bassoon. So you can see on this picture on the left, here is it's fully put together with the vocal and the reed and everything, and here is it in its case. This instrument, as well as the Baroque bassoon, you notice that they are four distinct parts, whereas before they were one or two, or one that was separated into two with maybe a little attachment at the top. So these ones are four fully distinct pieces, which is helps with their portability, not when they're put together, but when they are taken apart. So we'll move on now to the parts of the modern bassoon. And so moving on to the parts of the modern bassoon, I have handed out a bit of a worksheet that's mirrored here on the screen. So what I would like you to do is use this word bank. Not all of these words will be used. Some of them are red herrings to throw you off. This is not graded or anything. This is a pretest, and we will come back later on in the semester and do a post-test version of this to kind of just check for understanding and see how far we've come in understanding what the different parts of the bassoon are. So there's a part here, 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 and then these two on this side. So take the next 5 minutes and fill this out. So at this point, I would let them take the quiz. As I'm not really checking, I'm not going to be grading this, so the time doesn't really matter. Any more than 5 minutes would be a bit unnecessary as we're just checking for understanding to see what they're doing first. This isn't going to be graded or anything, and so I kind of alleviate the pressure from the students because the next thing that we'll do is to be going over it. All right. Now that we've all done our quiz on the parts of the modern bassoon, again, it's not graded, so if you didn't get these things right, it's totally fine. This is something that you're going to be learning through the rest of the semester, as well as right now. These are the actual parts of the bassoon. We can see up here, there's the bell, this area up here, and then after this joint, down here is the long joint, which is, of course, called the long joint because it's long. Then we have the wing joint, which is called the wing joint, not because it's shorter, but because it has a bit of a wing here. It's not really well seen on this drawing, but you can see it more kind of here, where this little piece right there juts out a little bit and makes a bit of a wing structure. And then we have the boot joint down here at the bottom. And of course, the bocal, as we've been mentioning, and seeing its development being tracked over generations. And at the very end, we have the reed. So this is kind of a reference for this. Feel free to correct your own paper to make sure that you have this. And, it's a good reference to see which parts you guessed correctly and which parts you were unsure of to kind of go forward because we will be covering this at a later time as well, reviewing it later and also having a quiz that may or may not include labeling some of these things. Going on to more additional supplementary, auxiliary, but necessary parts of the bassoon are straps. For one, the seat strap that you can see here, which is a strap that you sit on. It goes on your seat and it hooks right here onto the bottom of the bassoon. Most bassoons at the bottom of their boot joint will have two holes. Um, some may only have one. So if you encounter one where the hole's on the wrong side, you can just kind of pull that cap off and turn it around and put it in the right place. Um, Another not as effective method of seat strap is the one that holds the bassoon entirely um, and encases it, which is great for newer students who are trying to adjust to the flexibility of holding the bassoon, but not as great for professional musicians who are trying to have full control over the instrument. It kind of holds it in one place and doesn't really give you a lot of freedom to move. And then we have here is a harness. This is a chest harness, one that straps, it goes around the body, and then it's held up on the either a neck strap hook or it's on a balance hanger, which we will go over in a second. Um, Notably, I do not have a neck strap on here. Do not play the bassoon with a neck strap. It will give you a lot of unnecessary neck and back and shoulder pain. Speaking as someone with experience who didn't know originally that you should use a C strap preferably or a kind of chest shoulder strap if you're standing. Uh, don't play with the neck strap. Next is the crutch, which is not necessary. Some people have hands that are too small to use a crutch, but this is mostly to be able to maintain control with your right hand, to be able to pivot and do all the fingerings that you need to do while keeping that nice curved shape that we want for playing a woodwind instrument. And finally, an auxiliary but necessary part would obviously include reed cases, reed cups for soaking your reeds, storage, soaking, and of course the reeds themselves. Although the reed is a requisite part that we already mentioned in the labeling section, but it is, of course, worthwhile to mention that reeds are a very important part of the instrument. It is, as it's what makes it make a noise. So some other optional parts include low A extensions. You can purchase them. This is what it looks like on a bassoon. You you can purchase more of a tube or a bell-like structure, or you can even just take a tube of paper. As long as you've tuned it to the point where it's making so low A, you put it into the bell, and then your low B flat will turn into a low A. Notably, this gets rid of your ability to play a low B flat, as well as making some of the other lower notes, the B and the C, kind of not sound as good and sound a little covered. Another one is the balance hanger. You can kind of see it here. It connects to the kind of like harness hole and extends it up. You can see one of the holes here. This is the actual balance hanger structure. So this goes into a hole that is drilled into the bassoon already. This goes into the harness kind of hook area, and then you can hook your harness onto these. And this takes a lot of the weight off of you personally and makes it a lot easier to stand with the bassoon. This one is very helpful. However, it's not necessary as, of course, you have to drill an extra hole into the bassoon, which makes it much more difficult for the typical bassoonist to always have. Final other optional part would be a bassoon stand. These come in many different varieties. Um, they're very helpful for rehearsals or longer gigs or keeping things out when you're practicing. Not necessary, very much desired. Now we move on to a brief little stop into bassoon fingerings. So here we have kind of a fingering chart legend. This is part of the handout packet that I gave out earlier. So you can kind of see how these little aquamarine turquoisey fingers are for the tone holes that your fingers actually cover, and everything else is a key, a metal key that would be pressed. Notably, your third finger on your right hand does not actually press a tone hole. It presses this G key here. So these fingers would be for the right hand first finger, second finger on the left hand. These are left hand up here. Left hand first finger, left hand second finger, left hand third finger, and the pinky. The right hand first finger would take these, second finger, your third finger, and then these are all for your right pinky. These are for, of course, the right thumb, and then these are for the left thumb. So briefly going into kind of the range, this fingering chart handout that I gave is going to be very helpful later on, as there may be a couple questions in later quizzes about fingerings and specific ranges and things. So at the very bottom here, we have B flat or A sharp 1, and you can kind of see how we use all of the notes. This is all fingers down, as the bassoon is one of the very few instruments to actually include the use of all 10 of our fingers to actually make notes and not just be used as support. So we have here kind of the lower range of the bassoon, and kind of notice how as we go up to the mid register, where this is kind of the typical bass octave of the bassoon. Um, as this is the template, as you can kind of see as we start to lose fingers here, the template that we'll see in the third octave here, where we have this F sharp fingering and this G fingering and this G sharp and A and all the way up to around D are all of the same, as you can see here. The D fingering, they're all the same, except they don't use the whisper key for most of them. And some of the ones down here notably use a half hole. You can see how this is like partially covered on these. Um, and so this helps to overblow at the octave. With some of these notes in particular are a little bit more difficult to get out. Um, and then these notes here are the flicking notes, A, B flat, B natural, and C. A uses this A flicking key right here. You can see it. And the other three notes, B flat, B natural, and C, they all use this C flick, which you can see right here. Then we kind of go up into the much, much, much higher register, where all of the fingerings start to get a lot more complicated. To that end, we have the stratosphere, which is the last couple notes here. You can see that we have the E flat and then the E, and then all the way up to a high F, theoretically, at the top of the treble clef staff. And I say theoretically because a lot of these fingerings are theoretical. They're experimental, not always going to work on every single bassoon. The more high quality professional bassoon you have, the more likely that you'll be able to get these notes out. More of a student level resin bassoon will probably not be able to get these because it requires the use of a couple of these higher fingerings and these special keys. But yeah, that's everything that we're going to go over for today. And so next time we'll continue on going over the history of the bassoon in liturgical context. Thank you for watching.